I'm Andy Crouch, inviting you to download and listen to the new Beer Edge podcast, a source for news, information, and insight regarding the brewing industry and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. The show, co-hosted by John Holl and I, talks with key players on the front lines of the beer business to give you insights and advice on how to navigate these uncharted waters. The Beer Edge podcast is available on all major platforms, or you can visit us at beeredge.com/podcasts. Thanks for your support.
Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer. It's the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Holl, and man, it's been weird these last couple of months, and I think a lot of us have been rethinking our beer consumption, our beer traditions, and what it is that we want to comfort us during these times. And, for some of us, it's been going back to beers that influenced our drinking habits and careers from an early age, to going back to what our parents or our grandparents drank to sort of forge a connection with them on a deeper level. And given my job, I get to talk to a lot of people who enjoy good beer, and for the last couple of weeks, I've been doing socially distanced driveway beers here in the suburbs of New Jersey. And about a week and a half ago, a friend of mine brought by some fresh to him that was muled back from the West Coast, Alaskan Amber. And I hadn't had that beer in maybe, 2, 3, 4 years now at this point. And when you drink it, it's sort of background music. It's not necessarily a beer that you think about. It's just a beer that's there when you're in certain cities and in certain states and having a good time, because it's a solid citizen of the world of beer. But I really started thinking about this beer as I was tasting it, standing in my driveway, and the journey that it had made, and the history that beer has, and how it has played into the overall beer industry these days. And so I wanted to call up Geoff and Marcy Larson. They founded the brewery in 1986. They've been around for the majority of the craft brew movement. They've seen the good, the bad, and the otherwise, and they've built one of the largest breweries in the country in one of the most unlikely places in the country. So when I do this show, the way that it typically works, to give you a little bit of a peek behind the scenes, you usually hear me say, here's our conversation. What happens before that is I'm talking with folks, and we're going through last minute, okay, here's what we're going to hit, here's what you should worry about. I usually don't give people a heads up as to what they're going to worry about, but it's usually here's what you don't have to worry about, because we have about 45 minutes when we're recording live to tape. And I usually start off by saying, just so I can go back later on in the tape, I'll say, who are you and what do you do? And this sort of helps me remember, if I have to listen to a tape later on, who they are and what they do, and also hear how they pronounce their name, so hopefully when I'm going to say it later on, I don't butcher it. And it's usually just a little bit of patter as I'm dialing in the levels and getting everything working. So we had Geoff and Marcy both on landlines from their house. Marcy is on a wireless phone that I guess hasn't been used in quite some years, and so she's on for the first couple of minutes, and then her battery dies and she falls off. But I'm keeping in this sort of B matter, this B-roll of conversation, because the two of them, who have been working and married to each other, working with and married to each other for so long, they have this fun back and forth that I think only comes with time and experience, and because we could all use a little bit of levity in this day and age. I'm keeping it in. So you're going to hear a little bit of the behind the scenes before Marcy drops off, and then Geoff and I continue on. Anyway, unedited now, here's our conversation. So for the purposes of this tape, can you both tell me who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm Geoff Larson, and when we started Alaskan Brewing back in 1986, I was pretty much focused on production.
And I'm Marcy Larson, and back when we started in 1986, Geoff and I were just newly married, and this was all his idea. I want to make that clear. And he had the great idea of starting a brewery up here in Alaska, and I got to tag along and do all the paperwork and the administrative background behind the brewer, along with helping clean tanks, etc.
And this is, a great way to start with conflict, because we argue about whose idea it was. And actually, I'd say Marcy got to Alaska before I did, and so when I moved up, we had our different backgrounds. Mine's engineering, chemical engineering, and hers was photojournalism / accounting, and so we explored Alaska and enjoyed the place, and then discovered the people. But then we also wanted to explore maybe a more intimate lifestyle in regards to working together. So we both tended to take work as a very fundamental part of our life. So we immersed ourselves in whatever we did, and starting the brewery ended up being a cooperative affair.
Well, so here's the thing. I'm not here to play marriage counselor by any means, but if you're both sort of blaming each other, your website tells a third story where it says under a daring solution under the About Me page on the Alaskan Brewing Company, Marcy and Geoff were drawn to the beauty and adventure of Alaska, but finding a livelihood that would allow them to stay was a challenge. Quote, "Why not start a brewery?" a friend suggested. So now there's a mysterious third person who has entered into this conversation that neither of you have blamed yet. And this is for the whole world to see.
That was conflict avoidance. Truly.
I promised you, I said early on this wasn't going to be a gotcha journalism show, but it kind of, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's one of the strengths that we've always had, is that we both have, we're individuals.
Yeah.
Alaska is the land of the individual and other endangered species. And what we have always had as an advantage is a complementary relationship in regards to having different perspectives, but then through the amalgam of working through it, we come to some reasonable solution. But no, it's always been a kind of a funny thing that she blames me and I blame her, and at the end of the day, we're extraordinarily fortunate and happy and lucky to have had the opportunity to do what we did when we did it, and it's been great.
It
is great.
Has been, yes. We really enjoyed it, and working together has worked out for us, and partly because we had our own areas that we could focus on and bring some value together. But, yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, but also I think the mutual love of the products that we make and where we make it. And also I think the influence of our locale made a difference in the end products. The quality of life and the quality of product, I think, go hand in hand.
So let's talk about locale for a second, because, again, going back to this website, you guys are saying 67th of the craft breweries, microbrew, independent, whatever moniker we're going to put on small breweries these days. Juneau strikes me as a great place to have a brewery if you just want to serve beer in and around Juneau, which there's the city and maybe not a whole lot less or a whole lot more. But you guys are in multiple states now, and one of the larger breweries in the country, and certainly known throughout the world for the beers that you make. When you first started the brewery, and when you were planning on starting the brewery, was huge expansion, multi-state expansion, regional expansion, was that ever part of, like, even the vaguest of hopes?
No.
Next question.
Just the state was big enough. That was the intent right there. And you got to remember, when we started, even in our state, home brewing was illegal. Nobody abided by that, but
Sure.
it was, and absolutely you could not make beer and sell beer on premise yourself. So there were a lot of limitations that kind of pushed us into being a production brewery right out of the gate.
Yeah, and while we have a tasting room, it was more as a platform for people to maybe intimately see us as a manufacturer. I think it was kind of funny. Manufacturing has such a dry kind of character, but up here in Alaska, there was a tendency to think about really it was an extractive resource state. I mean, whether it be oil or timber or fishing, it wasn't that creative manufacturing thing. So for us, we wanted to show people, you can be small, you can be, pretty creative, you can do something different. And back then, essentially, the whole craft boutique brewery scene, as they used to call it, was, pretty kind of outside of the normal thinking. But I would say Alaska created its own sets of challenges that actually created, I think, opportunities for us to do things and see things differently. But one of the things that was kind of fun was looking at that platform of maybe having people see us. Marcy did a lot of research and found a lot of breweries back at the turn of the century, pre-Prohibition, that existed in Alaska because, quite frankly, even though the miners and loggers and the like were up here seasonally, maybe working hard, they still wanted that beverage that they expected from their local producer. So we had quite a few inspirational moments looking at some of the historical advertisements and the like. And so our first beer, the Alaskan Amber, was based upon a recipe from that Gold Rush era. And we got interviews from the newspapers of the brewers at the time and some of the challenges keeping ale yeast warm. And then, lo and behold, Marcy discovered a old collector that was kind of collecting Alaska memorabilia. And Marcy, tell the story about, Nick Nichols.
Yeah.
Oh, she dropped off with the battery.
Oh, she left?
Yep, her battery died on the handset. Well, what she had found was a collector who had all the old shipping receipts and invoices for raw materials for this brewery on Douglas Island, which is part of Juneau.
Mm-hmm.
And so our Alaskan Amber is based upon essentially a recipe from 1907, the Douglas City Brewing Company, pieced together based upon receipts of the crystal malt that they'd ordered and the pale malt, the ratios, and then the Bohemian hop, which now is called Foss.
Okay.
So we put it together with the cold fermentation of an ale because basically there were icebergs in downtown Juneau at that time. The Taku Glacier was still shedding icebergs getting to downtown Juneau. So it's just it was fun to be able to sit there and try to put a little bit of Alaska in the glass in as much as we could. So, we didn't have that yeast from that era, but we knew it was an ale yeast. So that was kind of the beginning of maybe looking at where we are should influence, what we make.
But that's sort of the interesting thing that I was thinking about when, so you coming around in 86, which is 6 years after Sierra Nevada was founded, about 10 years, maybe 11 years after New Albion, the original microbrewery was founded. But everybody who came before you, more or less, was in an area where there is at least access to hops or access to raw ingredients, or at least sort of a current culture that would sort of I have a customer base, but that also it was relatively easy to get ingredients. And where you are in your state, I mean, it's not necessarily like as easy as calling somebody up and saying, hey, can I get a delivery, tomorrow? You really have to sort of plan some of these things out in the early days. And I even imagine, still today. So when you were putting Amber together and you're looking at some of these raw ingredients and then thinking about the other beers that you wanted to make, were there a lot of similarities in ingredients so that you could order in bulk and then make a multitude of style, but based on 3 or 4 base malts and 1 or 2 hops at the time?
Well, obviously, even in the ancient times of the 1980s and 90s,
we're not all that old. Let's not call it ancient
I know,
just yet, Geoff.
But I mean, obviously, access was something that you could logistically accomplish. Now, for us in Alaska, yes, there were some hurdles that were maybe not necessarily typical of a brewery like a New Albion or being in Chico or wherever. But you could do it, and we did it. So that was just kind of the nature. Sometimes ignorance is bliss. Hey, this is what we got to do. The interesting thing at that time, though, this is when the Iron Curtain was up. So getting the Saaz hops from Czechoslovakia, because that's what the brewer did back in 1907 when Czechoslovakia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is pre-World War I.
Right.
I mean, we had to plan, and so we were getting hops from behind the Iron Curtain over, and it was different, interesting. But then you fast forward 15, 20 years later, we've been doing contracts for hops for decades when all of a sudden there was a hop shortage. And, well, we already have contracts. That's the way we do it because of those limitations. So what was a challenge, basically in the latter part of the 80s and early part of the 90s was basically we were head of the the way of doing business that ended up having to be, the natural way of doing business. You buy contracts over decades. I would have to say, even like right now, I mean, we have been collecting our CO2 off of fermentation since basically 1989, 90. And so what we're doing, we're collecting our CO2, and now there's a little bit of a CO2 shortage. Well,
right.
We've been using our own CO2 for decades. And quite frankly, the CO2 that we were using is not a greenhouse gas. It's from grain. Yes, it's CO2. CO2 is CO2. But much of the CO2 in this country is made by burning fossil fuels and then purifying it. So it ends up, there's challenges that we have, but there are other places that have challenges. I have a friend who was brewing in the middle of summer in Pensacola, Florida, and talk about being hot and humid.
Yeah, tough to make lagers.
Boy, poor guy, and 120 degrees in his brew house. We don't have that problem. We do not have that problem. Our groundwater is 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
Year round.
Yeah.
I mean, so as far as being able to cool things down in the brew house, we heat recovery, obviously all the heat from our kettle boils, but but still we have challenges, yes, but every place has challenges, and we also have advantages.
When you think about Amber and the evolution of it, so based on piecing together old bill of sales and creating something, the beer has obviously evolved over time. You've discovered flavors that you like, and you've become a stronger brewery, and you've had better equipment as you've grown. What do you think? Is there a difference taste-wise, do you think, between some of those first batches of 86 and where we are halfway through 2020? And I don't know, how is the beer, if there is, how has the beer evolved, and in what ways?
I would say, I remember the first half dozen batches, we would be tasting the beer, first bottling, second bottling, third bottling, and our objective has always been to try to be consistent with our Alaskan Amber. And so I would say, as far as evolution of flavor, we always try to hit the mark. And I would say over the course of 30 years, we've gotten more and more consistent in that capability. And I would say the health of our yeast, the frequency with which we brew, all those things add a huge amount of integrity to being able to hit the mark. And then you're talking about the attributes of the beer from the swickle is different than the beer in the bottle 2 months after packaging.
Right.
Well, how do you reduce that oxidation exposure? And then canning. How do you make that work better? So I would say the wonderful thing that's occurred in the 30 plus years is the equipment we needed to use back in 1986. The availability of high quality equipment was challenging for us. And today, small breweries in the U.S. are really driving an improvement on those types of quality of equipment, quality of raw materials, and support, whether it be insurance for a small manufacturing operation to expertise that you can tap into, from microbiological expertise to production planning expertise. It's been an amazing wild ride. I tell you, what a roller coaster! But it's been just exciting. I mean, there's so many dimensions to it. The flavor dimension, oh my goodness, the flavor dimensions of the last 35 years. Oh my goodness.
Well, and that's sort of what I'm curious about, though, of going back to Amber of '86 and Amber of mid 2020, because when you're talking about hitting the mark, consumer palates have changed. I mean, any sort of hop content in the early 1980s, by and large, would have been heresy by the majority of beer drinkers, and now we have people who give me 100 plus IBUs, and it's still not enough. With some other customers. So when you're talking about trying to hit the mark on, especially a flagship, which has, it's become what the brewery is known for, and what people seek out. Did you have to adjust not only in house, but were you also soliciting consumer feedback, or was it as you added new employees, people would come in and say, boy, you know what, I wish this had was just a little bit more. And I'm not saying you changed the recipe overnight or anything, but certainly, things can start to feel, I don't know, like of a time and sort of left behind if brewers aren't necessarily thinking about, the larger thing, or if a beer is too precious.
Yeah, I know where you're going with this, but I would say probably philosophically, we are maybe kind of different in that way. We're not looking at wanting to make Alaskan Amber a moving target for the consumer. This is what we strive for. It has a historical root, but we produce a lot of different products.
Oh, sure.
And some of them have a malty, more backbone kind of character. Others have a lot more of a hop backbone. Others have, absolutely a different flavor profile, not necessarily typical of beer. I mean, spice or maybe herbally influenced. We were quite taken again a little bit by some of that historical research. So Captain Cook was really, well known as he sailed the oceans all over the world, but he also was looking for the Northwest Passage. And
right.
On his second voyage, he was going up as far as he could, and but he also he was a prolific writer. He was also very well known for the health of his crew, because he was very much a captain who looked for local fresh ingredients, and so he was quite well known for foraging. So there were 14 different references to using spruce in making beer on board his ships. Some of them were not necessarily positive references. He talked about using the boughs, which the branches of the spruce, and he even said his mutinous crew, does not appreciate the efforts of this spruce beer. But then he had another reference where he talked about using the young new sprouts of the spruce and how delicate and beautiful the expressions of the beer were, and his crew was very appreciative. Well, we come to find out, we looked at the spruce tips, as we call them.
Yeah.
And we did a oil fractioning, and lo and behold, they have a very noble set of humulins and the like that are similar to the noble hops. And so, miraculously, which maybe not miraculously, here's a fellow who's fairly, organoleptically inclined. He likes good flavors, and he's finding the spruce tips to be really good. His crew likes it. Well, there's a reason. It's familiar to them.
So
and spruce tips have a really interesting character, and they are a little bit they have a little bit of a fruity character, a little bit berry-like, but they also have some sugars from, the first flush of sap coming into the tree's limbs. And so they add actually a non-fermentable sugar that tends to, again, add a little bit more of the body to the beer. So we've used it in a number of beer styles, from IPAs to old ales. And there's a local kind of character that we like to talk about too. It's just, here's something that's kind of really very interesting and unique.
And we're recording this in mid-June, so we're, I guess, probably towards the tail end of the spruce tip picking season, right? When do you normally go out and? No,
you're absolutely right. There are places, there's little microclimates all around here. You go up in the higher elevations, and you can still get the new growth of the spruce. But yeah, we have harvested already, but that's at sea level. But
sure.
You can still see them. I'm looking at them right now, all around our place.
Well, that's just a lost opportunity that you're just leaving on the trees right now, Geoff. I mean, that's...
Hey, we got lots of spruce up here, I'll tell you that.
So I didn't want to dwell too long on Amber, and you talked about how you've made all of these other beers. And I'm always curious to talk with brewers about beers that they were especially passionate about that just never caught on commercially. And everybody has one of, you make a beer and you taste it and you do the research and, it's a baby to you, and you put it out into the world, and everybody who tastes it just kind of gives it a shrug, and it's acts of humility, I guess, for a brewer. Was there a beer that you've put out in your history that you were hopeful about and excited about and passionate about, that you just sort of had to leave behind because the sales weren't there?
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's probably there's quite a few. I would say the one that probably really I think hit all of us was we started out 1989 with a late hop edition of Centennial hops in a product we called Autumn Ale, and it won a gold at the Great American Beer Festival in the let's see, at that time it'd be probably IPA category, but it was just kind of at the beginnings of the hop IPA blossoming. It then became we called it Frontier, then we called it ESB. And it ended up being the third most award-winning beer at the Great American Beer Festival. But by 2010, we were, the sales weren't there for it to be maintained in its as fresh a character as we would want. in the marketplace, so we had to let it go, even though it had won the third most medals at the time of any beer in the GABF. But the thing is that medals aren't what drives sales, and sales drives the freshness and the quality of the product on the shelf.
Yeah.
So for us to be able to make sure that our products were always what we wanted the consumer to experience, it ended up becoming more infrequently brewed. We will brew it once in a great while. But yeah, I would have to say another one of our products that ended up kind of being caught by the changing winds of time was really focused on a specific hop, Tettnang,
Okay.
which lost so much acreage, and it was less and less acreage, and then it got to the point where it was like there was just one producer.
Yeah.
And we couldn't even get the choices of hop selections, so that we were totally dependent upon that season, that microclimate, and there was a variability there that we also couldn't feel good about.
When it was producing the way that you wanted, what was Tettnanger doing for the beer that you really loved?
Well, there were times when its characteristic was really just very delicate and beautiful. It really and at the time we just called it our pale ale. It was some nutty characters of muc malt and pale, but it was a very simple malt backbone.
Sure.
And so the delicate nature of the hop came through, and it was beautiful. But there were times when that hop character just did not get expressed because of that particular harvest. So another one we had to sit there and go, oh, God, let's let it go.
When you're talking about the changing landscape as well, you guys were obviously bottling early on, and then sort of came to the can game just a few years ago, right? And you've been upping the canned offerings. I mean, for some breweries in '86, and certainly even through the mid 1990s, I mean, cans were never really an option. Were you happy to embrace that format?
Yeah. Well, let me even go back further.
All right.
We started bottling, and we did not keg. We did not keg for almost 4 years, 3-4 years, because our worry was that keg can would become crab buoys in the Bering Sea. We were fearing that we would buy these kegs and we wouldn't get them back because they'd be converted into
not that it wouldn't sell
at
at the accounts, but that people would just take them and then just throw them out into the sea.
Correct. Use them for crab buoys. Oh God.
Did you ever come across somebody who did that after you started kegging?
Actually, no.
Okay.
But we're naive. We didn't know. We had lots of fears. Many fears that we had really never came to forbearance. But then there was a lot of things that did come to the forefront that did.
What was an early fear that you think you had that didn't come to fruition, and then what's one that took you by surprise?
Well, one that we were naive about was borrowing money from a bank that cost us 2 points over prime. And prime was 15.5%. So we were borrowing money at interest rates that today people would be going, say what?
Yeah.
But we were naive and we were young, and that's what we were doing. We were borrowing it for our inventory loans, so borrowing it from malt, and then we paid it down. It was a credit line. So that was an interesting one because we didn't know any better. That's the nature of the game. This is how you do it, and we came through it, borrowing money at interest rates that were anywhere from 12 to 18%.
Wow.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then one that bit us that was strange was Black Thursday, when the stock market took a tumble. And a lot of banks in Alaska were on the edge of bankruptcy because of real estate values going down. So we did not make deposits in our bank for a couple days, Black Thursday. So that finally around Friday, there wasn't a run on the bank. So, okay, our bank is fine. So we ended up, was it Black Tuesday? No, it was Black Tuesday. That's what it was. It was Black
Okay.
Tuesday. So we didn't make deposits for a couple days. And finally we said, okay, time to do it. So we drove up at around 10 o'clock at night to make our deposit, and all the bank lights were on. And on this little drop slot was masking tape said out of order. So how do you have a little blank, chute for your deposits be out of order? So we went around the front, and there was a big posting that we read, and as we were reading it, a marshal came up with another man in black, looking austere, looking at us, and it was basically the FDIC had seized the bank.
Wow.
Closed our bank. Our bank went out of business. And I was like, huh. So what we did is we were looking in there, and all the lights were on, and all the tellers were at their desks, and all the bank personnel were there working at 10:30 at night on Friday. And they all looked not very happy.
No.
And so we left, went to a liquor store, bought 2 6-packs of beer.
Do you remember what beer?
Brought
Was
them
it
back.
yours?
Yeah, Alaskan Amber. Held up the 2 6-packs to show everyone behind the counters and put them down at the base of the door.
Okay.
And the marshal came up and was like sternly saying no, and kind of looking like, hey, you can't do this. And we just shrugged our shoulders and said, as if, what are you going to do? Come out here and handcuff us? And we turned around and left. And then we drove around the block, and then we hid in an alley and watched. And so the FDIC guy and the marshal kind of like exchanged looks and then kind of opened the door, grabbed the 2 6-packs, and brought it in. And come to find out, like weeks and weeks later, that the tellers were saying, basically they came in and we were treated as criminals. We were responsible for the public's money, and the public's money was not safe in our hands. So we were fired that day, allowed to be hired for 2 weeks by the FDIC. But we were required to account for every paperclip in our desks. They searched all our purses, our personal belongings.
Wow.
And basically it was a dehumanizing experience. But at that juncture, when they brought the 2 6-packs in, and at the end, they heard the story about how the bank had financed part of our operation. It became a much more human spot, because then they said, "Oh, let's have a beer." And so that was the unexpected surprise.
We're at
Our bank failed.
Yeah. We're at a weird point in America, and I think an important point in America right now, where a little bit of humanity and a little bit of understanding and greater appreciation for our fellow humans goes a long way. And on other shows that I've done recently, the whole conversation has been around COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement. And early on, I think when certainly in '86, there was almost a sense of, if you were in a service industry and an owner of a service industry, you didn't wade into social matters too much. People would come to your place and they could discuss those things, but the owners themselves were basically like Switzerland, because you wanted to serve everybody, and that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case these days. I'm curious as to how your brewery is navigating these waters right now, where people want to know where you stand, and people want to know you know, what, you know, who works for you, what they believe. Because this is new for a lot of brewery owners, and you've obviously been through a lot, and you've seen, a lot of change happen in the overall industry. Have you ever seen, or even come close to seeing what we're going through right now?
Well, yeah, you know, I was a fairly young son, and so, and I had an inspired moment to start interviewing my dad over the last couple decades of his life, and just I would get my remote camera, the remote mic, and then just have a conversation with him. And so I was able to stitch together a lot of his stories. My dad was a diplomat. I mean, he worked for the Foreign Service,
Mm-hmm.
so we lived all over the world. And but he was a farmer at heart, and he always talked about, "Hey, I'm just a farmer." But he depression, Dust Bowl. He landed at Normandy on D-Day.
Amazing.
He landed at noon. First wave on D-Day was at 6 a.m. Second wave was at 9 a.m. He was the third wave.
Christ almighty.
You know what? Sorry. I did not serve in Vietnam. I did not serve in Iraq or, Afghanistan. So I look at the fact that I've lived a very, 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 very uniquely sheltered life. So when the COVID thing started hitting, it was like, there's times when you're called to service in different ways. You don't really necessarily have the opportunity to volunteer. You are not required to. But, everyone was just reeling. And I'd have to say that, how do you personally react and respond? And there's a lot of unknowns and fear but for us it was pretty straightforward. We started talking, saying, okay, what do we have to do? Well, the most important thing for us was we wanted to be able to support our crew. So support our crew health-wise, support our crew financially in a way that could give us time to sit there and navigate what's coming down the pike. So, we kind of formulated a plan. Obviously in the beverage business, we're part of the critical infrastructure. So, we had the opportunity to continue operating. We were mainly a production brewery. We did have the hospitality part of our business, but that wasn't our main focus.
Right.
But we did, obviously shut down the on-premise service side, but we were still producing. And we segmented our brewery into different cells of working groups, making sure that we had, basically even before the term contact tracing started, we had 5 different areas of our operation. Marcy and I are involved in search and rescue. So we were basically not allowed to be associated with different parts of our production facilities because we were more on the front line, exposed to a lot of different people, so we could be a vector of introduction. So we were allowed to be in the brewery. But then all of a sudden we also realized, we have supply chain opportunities here. We have the capability of bringing in quaternary ammonium chloride for hard surface sanitizing, and so with our supply chain, we brought in 55-gallon drums of hand sanitizer. We donated that to the city for their operations. We ended up creating a 2-week period where we gave hand sanitizer to the consumers or to the public for free. We worked with a local nonprofit to be able to finance that. And then, we supply basically, we had a routine where people could come in, bring in their empty hand sanitizer bottles or Windex bottles. We would give them a label to put on there, and it was a legit FDA approved hand sanitizer for use in food plants.
Yeah.
We described to them what it was, and here's the label to affix to that non-labeled container. We did that for 2 weeks, and then because we're within the search and rescue community, Marcy and I have a canine dog that
Mm-hmm.
is basically trained for finding lost people.
Yeah.
So we got in touch with our incident commands group, and so all the first responders in this area were put in line with us. So we were able to again send them, 1-gallon jugs of hand sanitizer in 4-gallon case lots. So
Mm-hmm.
we sent them to places like Yakutat, Sitka, Wrangell. Actually, I put Wrangell in tune with our suppliers, so they ordered direct. I worked with the state procurement division so that they could get a direct supply line with our supplier. It really wasn't a hand sanitizer shortage as much as just a logistical disruption. All the stores were wiped out because it was just, fast response.
Oh,
People
sure.
bought a lot. So we just knew that we had to, we could facilitate some of those changes. So, we try to find a way to respond. And we immediately gave all of our staff 2 weeks paid leave before anything the government did. We said, okay, 2 weeks paid leave. You can use it how you want. You can, if you feel uncomfortable, stay home. If you feel sick, stay home.
No, certainly. Yeah.
But then, that was a big hit right off the bat. We just knew that this was going to be a cost, and so let's just give everyone 2 weeks of breathing room, knowing that there's not going to be an interruption in their own financial world. But then I started looking. I worked with the procurement offices, and so they put out a request for information, and all of a sudden I say, oh, well, viral transport media. Well, we can do that.
Yeah.
So we've put in our CDC protocols for the manufacturing it. We've made our first batch. We've sent it off for sterility testing and for viability testing.
And Geoff, let me just stop you.
Alaska.
Just for folks who don't necessarily know what viral transport media is, can you give us just a little bit of background?
Yeah. So if you go in to get a test, they'll take a swab, and then they put it in this tube with solution, and that solution then preserves that sample for it to survive time before it actually gets analyzed.
Mm-hmm.
So in the state of Alaska, we have a lot of rural communities that aren't connected to any healthcare provider. So we're kind of reeling from realizing that if we have a small community that has an outbreak, it's going to get there's going to be a SWAT team that goes out there to make sure that we test everyone and get that material back to see who needs to be quarantined and who doesn't. And so there's going to be some really amazing supply requirements. And so we just see, we make media all the time. We make 1 to 5 liters a week, and we're talking 3 mils per tube. This is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
We can make 1,500 tubes a week without even sweating. So everyone can sit there and make a difference, and it's just you have to figure out what's in your wheelhouse and how can you help.
And that's regardless of size, I imagine, right? I mean, it sort of goes to the ethos of what craft purports itself to be. And a lot of folks have been able to, walk the walk as opposed to just, talking the talk in the last couple of months.
And I also, I think also, I think I'm influenced by where I am. I live in Alaska, and so, I catch crab, I share it, I give it to my neighbors. I catch a lot of crab, Dungeness crab.
Okay.
And I catch more than I eat, so I share it with my neighbors. I think of the fact that I live in a unique place. Social distancing. That's why many of us like to live up here.
Yeah.
But more than that, I think we also are acutely aware that there are times when we need help from our neighbors, and so reaching out is kind of commonplace. And I have to say that, to your point about this time and humanity, I think everyone is starting to feel that way, regardless of where they are. We don't have Alaska's residents don't have a lock on that. Everyone really are parts of communities, and breweries are parts of communities. So I think there's a predisposition in our industry to think about the older gentleman that always came by on Friday night for a beer, to maybe even think about reaching out to that older gentleman and say, "Hey, how you doing? We have curbside.
Yeah.
Do you want your beer?" I really believe that is maybe a legacy of this period. We're going to be more appreciative of those intimate contacts and intimacies that we right now are being asked to kind of distance ourselves from.
Before I let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk to you about the importance of smoke beer. And listeners of this show, I think, are fans of all things smoked beer. And you were a pretty early adopter. I think, again, going back to the historical records, right? That you were reading and coming along with, but in those early days of the brewery, I mean, you were putting out smoked porter, which is still sort of hard to come by and large. Do Americans not appreciate smoked beer as much as they should?
It's really interesting to think about smoke characters. And
by the way, do you like that I just totally switched from like social issues to smoked beer with you without any warning whatsoever and a really poor transition?
Oh no, I thought the transition was fine. I think the transition's fine. I'll whip one on you.
Yes, sir.
When we were asked by the Brewers Association to write a book in regards to smoked beers.
Yeah, with Ray Daniels. Yeah.
Yeah, with Ray Daniels. It was really it was a really fun experience. But I called the Library of Congress and asked for a research librarian. So I talked to him, and I went to University of Maryland, so I would go to the Library of Congress to study. I would find old texts having to do with chemical engineering, and I'd be studying them just for different, example problems to get immersed in the subject matter. So Library of Congress was my go-to library. And so I asked the librarian, I said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be writing about beers with smoke character. Could you guide me as to how I would do this remotely with the Library of Congress? And the response was, well, we're not the best resource for that type of information. And I'm like, what? You have a copy of every book in the world.
Library of Congress, yeah.
They said, no, we do not have a copy of every book in the world. We have a lot of books, but we don't have a copy of every book. There are specific collections which I could recommend to you. Let me get back to you. 2 days later, he calls back and says, I recommend that you look for these 3 collections of books. Well, the one that I was able to find a thread of information on where it was a collection called the Hurdy Peck Collection.
Okay.
And it was a guy who collected books in, let me think, this would have been 1890.
Okay.
He made soft drinks. He made soft drinks in 1890. And he decided to collect every book written in English having to do with beverages.
Wow. That's
And
kind of
so
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. So then
it really is,
place,
yeah.
Yeah, place to place to place. And, oh, yeah, no, we sold that collection. Oh, no, we sold that collection. Oh, we sold that collection. And the final buyer was University of California at Davis campus. I called them up. And they said, you are the first person who has ever asked about that collection. I said, well, can I come visit? They said, yes. So I got there, and I spent 3 days immersing myself in books written all the way from the 1600s to, 1890. And it was amazing.
I'll bet.
Disappointingly, I found that I didn't find a lot of positive references towards smoke in beer.
Really?
Yeah, and I was like, oh, how can I spin this one? And the research librarian on day 2 came up to me and said, hey, let me just talk to you about your research. What do you, and I said, oh, this is what I'm doing. He says, well, you've been really diligent, and I'm really very appreciative of your, absolute kind of studious way of handling the books, but also reading the books, and then also copying. But do you do this a lot, research? And I said, no. Okay, word of advice. You have to think about when these books were written. You're looking at books published in 1700s. Well, who wrote those books? I said, well, obviously, somebody who's capable of writing. Who brewed beer back in the 1700s? I said, well, don't you think it probably was women that brewed the beer? And women back then were not educated. They were not told how to write and read. So here you have a man who isn't brewing, who's writing about brewing. Keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
You're reading through a very strange filter, and you're trying to gain information. You have to place yourself in that time. So I'm going, okay. It started to really kind of dawn on me. Why would anybody reference smoky flavors in food when they're cooking over an open fire, when every cottage is heated by wood or coal? The whole town smells of smoke. Why would you even reference smoke unless it was above and beyond normal levels?
Mm-hmm.
All beers had smoke character because all beer was using roasted malt. All manner of foods were smoky. The only time you'd say, and that's what the references were, it smacked too much of smoke. Maybe not even saying too much. It smacked of smoke. They talked about the various types of woods. So anyway, I go back to wanting to just tell you I can get off topic real quick.
Yeah, boy, did
Just
you!
like
But that was fun, and I really enjoyed it. But like when you first created a smoked beer and you put it out there, and you were drawing off of historical texts and historical recipes. I mean, they're divisive today. I can't imagine what it was, 30 years ago.
Oh yeah, no, it was absolutely crazy. It was crazy, but porters back in that period of time were very prevalent in Alaska during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was a little bit of a delayed response. That transition occurred earlier in the 1800s on the East Coast, where the Pilsner started to take over, but the darker roasted beers were very, very prevalent, and we knew that brewer had to be a little bit inventive. He probably ended up getting and did some of his own roasting. So the only hardwood around here was alder. So that's kind of that character. We also had a commercial smokehouse across the street from us, so we were able to roast our own grains over alder.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the genesis. We would enjoy smoked fish on Fridays with our neighbor, and we'd have beer, and then we said, it'd be kind of cool to have a smoked beer, which historically had some relevance to our locale. So we said, okay, let's just do this. So therein kind of laid the logic to creating it, and it was fun, and we had a blast, and it's still. What's amazing though is, again, we said beer is best when fresh. And so even though we would be tasting older and older beers, we soon discovered that smoked porter was different in that it had the capability of aging. Even at below alcohol strength of 6%, it still aged well. And really, I would say that was kind of another little bit of a surprise discovery and a fun kind of thing. I ended up talking to a group to have a tasting of some of the aged smoked porters, and it was Michael Jackson, Fred Eckhart, Charlie Papazian, Ed LaPerrell, Greg Noonan.
Boy, that's that's a Mount Rushmore right there.
Right, yeah. And we sat down and I had them taste older smoked porters, and that's when Michael Jackson said, one thing you should think about doing is letting some of the yeast stay, because we were still kind of filtering all our beers. And so So from 1993 on, we stopped filtering the smoke porter, and we left just a tiny little bit of yeast in it, just to let it be a kind of more of a living thing. But it's been an amazing journey. I tell you what, there's no question as far as this is a tough time for many people. We're all navigating it, and we're part of our community, indelibly so. And I think we'll pull out of this after the Spanish flu and the 1916, 1918.
Yeah.
What came after was the Roaring 20s.
Last question, just before I let you go. When you first started, I mean, there weren't a lot of shoulders to stand on. Number 67 in the modern brewery age. We're over 8,000 now. There's people standing on your shoulders and standing on their shoulders, and the industry has grown so much. If the last financial crisis of 2008 taught us anything, is that we're headed into a period of regrowth a couple years down the line, and there's going to be people who are home brewers, who are passionate about beer, who might hang their own shingle and start their own brewery, much like you and Marcy did back in the early days. What do you offer them as a piece of advice to the next generation, the coming generation of brewers, from somebody who's been in this for, almost 40 years now?
Well, I would say every commercial brewer, is a representative of the greater industry, the greater community of beer. And I will give the same advice that was given to me when I was investigating. I went up to a small brewery in Utica, New York, FX Mac. The third was there, and he gave me a tour. And he basically said, you represent, if you make beer commercially, you represent all beer producers. Make the best beer you can. And unbeknownst to me, he wrote Fritz Maytag in San Francisco. So I went en route to Alaska as I was moving to Alaska. I ended up getting my Greyhound bus, take it through San Francisco, and took a tour of the brewery in San Francisco. Carpenter, I think, gave me the tour.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and Fritz Maytag searched me out, and he said, "Hey, I got a letter from FX Matt. Said if you ever came through, touch base." So I sat there and spent a couple hours talking to Fritz Maytag, and just think, New York, California, the community of brewers back then was small, intimate.
Yeah.
And I just remember, just being impacted by that. And Marcy and I came from kind of more or less teetotaling families.
Okay.
They weren't necessarily enthusiastic about us, getting in the beer biz. But those two really kind of instilled a sense of nobleness to this industry that was very, very heartening. But their insistence on making quality beer and its reflection on the greater community of beer and its place in society was really impactful. And it was the day before Thanksgiving, because I remember Fritz Maytag had to pick up a turkey from his local grocer that he was going to cook the next day.
Of course he did.
And then he dropped off another turkey at the Greyhound station bus, so I could go north to Seattle to catch the ferry to Alaska back in November.
Well, a quick look at the Brewers Association numbers right now from the last year. You're number 22 as far as craft brewery goes, and FX Matt is number 16. They've been around for a lot longer. You're catching up on them pretty quick. So you obviously learned a lot during those conversations. Geoff, I wish I could do this every week. I know you probably don't feel the same way, but it's always a pleasure talking with you. And thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Well, John, I appreciate the outreach, and thank you for what you do.
That's Geoff Larson of Alaskan Brewing Company, and earlier on in the conversation, Marcy Larson of Alaskan Brewing Company. There's so much beer history that exists that has happened during our lifetimes that we might not be aware of. And conversations like this are a reminder to me that we need to talk with the early pioneers and the early craft adopters to make sure that these stories get out into the world. And, of course, we need to support the makers of smoked beers. What's important to you in beer and what's being overlooked? What history should be explored? Let me know by reaching out via email. It's John Holl, JOHNHOLL @beeredge.com, or you can reach me on Twitter at John_Holl. And if you haven't yet, please go to your podcast platform of choice and leave a review of the show. It's such an odd ask, but honestly, it's how things work today. And your support, it matters a lot, and it goes a long way. And please check out beeredge.com for beer news and insight, and subscribe to our newsletter. And also make sure to listen to the Beer Edge podcast. Nate Schweber does the music. Jeff Quinn designed our logo. And once again, check out Andy Crouch, noted beer villain, on the Beer Edge podcast with new episodes every week. There's also Steal This Beer every Monday and the BYO Nano podcast on the 15th of every month. I'm happy to host both of those shows, or co-host both of those shows. And we have all of your beer needs covered between all of these various podcast platforms. Why go anywhere else? New episodes of this show are released every Wednesday. And if you're new, I hope you'll subscribe and you'll come back to the weekly conversation. And if you like what you hear, again, please consider leaving a review. In the meantime, I'm John Holl, and I'll be back next week to drink beer and to think beer.